when you joined the FDA, how was it an immediate sort of reaction, like, oh crap, look, there's a lot of stuff going on here that I don't want to be involved in, or was it something that evolved over time? Was you asked to do anything in particular that which you thought was perhaps not quite right, or did you see what was going on there, or can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. I think this is. I'm so glad that you're leading it here, because I think one of the biggest realizations that I had going through all of this was learning about how these institutions that are meant to be protecting the public actually become corrupted. Because I think if you're on the outside, a lot of the time, you know that they're not really working to protect people in the way that they ought to be, because, you see disasters and things like that. And it can be hard to understand how that happens. Maybe you might imagine, like, are there some shady back channel deals? Are there bribes going on? Are there, is there, bad actors doing things that may seem, almost criminal? But the reality is, in some ways, much simpler and more disturbing. And I say it's more simple because it's really easy for people to understand, especially if they've worked in a corporate environment before, and they understand kind of the economics of things. So with that description, let's talk about what I learned at the FDA, and I'll try and unpack some things. Well, probably the first thing I learned at the FDA was that there was a lot of emphasis on drug approvals. And so we had about 15 people in the division of psychiatry, and most of our time was spent giving the green light to protocols that industry would send to us. Because, when you want to get a drug onto the market, you design a study, you want to recruit patients. But before you can do that, you have to get sign off for the FDA. They have to say, yeah, this is safe. You're not going to be endangering people. And that's part of the research enterprise, drug companies that have to do that because they need to get their 2 clinical randomized controlled clinical trials to get the drug on the market. That's legislation, really, that they need to do. So there's a huge drive for them to get that done. And so when they send it in, all hands on deck at the FDA, we're going to look at that protocol and get it done. Another big task that we spent a lot of time doing is something called the review of NDAs. And NDA is a new drug application. So when a company has done enough of these clinical trials and they want to get the drug on the market, they send them in a big packet over to the FDA, along with the animal research, maybe some studies on pharmacology showing how, justifying that the dose should be, once a day or twice a day, a big packet of information. And we look at that. And so you're listening to all of this and you're saying, hey, that sounds pretty reasonable. That sounds like, kind of good work that the FDA is doing. I'm glad someone's doing that. But where it gets a little tricky and kind of conflicted is that a long time ago, I think this happened in the 90s, the mid-90s, the industry was getting upset at the FDA. They were like, hey, we need you to review our stuff faster. The patent on our drugs are expiring. Why is this sitting on your desk for several months? Come on, let's get these drugs onto the market, review them. And FDA was underfunded, and essentially they said you could help us with the funding. And so that went through Congress, and this act called the PDUFA Act, I think it's Prescription Drug User Fee Act, stipulated that industry could actually pay FDA. They could give them, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe higher than that, to hire more people to kind of accelerate the rate at which they looked at these drugs. And so industry essentially said, we're going to give you all this money, but here are some timelines. If we send you a protocol, we need you to do it in 30 days. If we send you a new drug application, we need you to look at that in 9 months. No longer.
String attached, you're right.
Yeah. And any longer than that, you're going to be in breach of our contract and your funding is going to be in jeopardy. Up until now, that maybe that seems okay. Yeah, maybe that's just a compromise. But let me tell you how it affects the way things happen in the FDA now. the FDA kind of marches to that. They're solely focused, they're mostly focused really on doing that. And there's a lot of other things that happen with drugs, that don't have to do with drug discovery and drug development. For instance, post-marketing safety problems are a major one of these things. So, recently there's been the issue of PSSD, which is post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And, this is now, this is when people get on antidepressants, and it's uncommon, but a small proportion of them are developing permanent sexual dysfunction when they come off. This has been acknowledged by the EMA, the second largest drug regulator in the world. They've updated all of the labels for the SSRIs and the SNRIs, things like Effexor and Prozac, Lexapro, Zoloft, all those drugs. It's been acknowledged by Wendy Burns, who I think is a very senior psychiatrist over in the UK. But FDA has kind of been sitting on their hands for it. I mean, a petition went in there about 7 years ago from David Healy, and they haven't really done anything. So what I used to see there was that we would just be doing drug development type stuff, almost in the benefit of kind of helping industry reach their goals. And when these other things would be coming up, these other safety problems, we wouldn't be given the time to really look at them. In fact, there was no system built around it. And so I think that's like one way that I've really seen kind of the agency kind of been tilted towards being more drug friendly, and that they're really acting towards approval, and there's less emphasis on really understanding the safety problems that are turning up.
So it's more than it's more. Well, from what I can gather there, it's just about getting these applications through as quick as possible. Not really. Was there much attention paid to what the actual, I suppose side effects, the actual signs behind it? Was there like emphasis on that, or was it just about getting it through as quickly as we possibly can?
So yeah, so here's the thing: the research into the applications when they come on the market is actually pretty thorough. They're really looking at everything. But the problem is that a lot of these drugs, they're only studied, especially in psychiatry, for 2 to 3 months, right? So you get a really good picture of what's happening at the start, but as you may be aware, most psychiatric medications aren't taken for 2 to 3 months. In fact, the median duration of use is about 2 years. And we're at a point where I think, prior to COVID, 13% of adults were taking antidepressants, and some of the figures I've heard recently are even higher than that. I think I even heard that it was like 20% of adult women in the Western world are now on antidepressants, which is 1 in 5, wow, which is really high. And with a median duration of use of about 2 years there, there's a lot of, these drugs, the things that the drugs really change what they do over time. These are not static entities. They will have an effect within 2 to 3 months when you begin them, but because of a process in the body called homeostasis, which is essentially the body's way of rebalancing itself, the longer you're on a drug, the more kind of changes happen in the body to counteract that. A lot of people think that, serotonin drugs, they're acting on this really unique place in the brain, just affecting our mood in some, little way. But, the serotonin and all of these other neurotransmitters are active throughout the body. They're involved in the way our heart beats, the way our digestion happens, the way our blood vessels constrict. And if you're taking a drug for a long period of time that is disrupting those systems, then you end up, the body sends signals back up to the brain and says, you need to shut this system down. You need to make adjustments. You need to lose receptors. You need to change your sensitivity of the receptors so they can come back to the normal state. And that's going to take time. And so I think that really the understanding of the drug really isn't fully mapped out when it hits the market. But in many ways, I think, FDA isn't really paying attention to what's happening long term with the drugs afterwards. I don't think they're really looking at that closely. And so you come to a situation where and this is really relevant to what I do. I mean, we've got issues like protracted withdrawal, which is essentially a form of brain damage that happens to people when they come off antidepressants. You have PSSD, and you also have the issue of what I think is treatment-resistant depression or tardive dysphoria. And this is not just me. Other people have been talking about it. Like, what is the effect on your mood if you take a antidepressant drug that modulates your neurochemistry for several years? Is there a possibility that because there's a chemical in there and your brain is changing and your body's adapting in ways that could actually lead to a depressive state over time? And I mean, we've seen this with many, many other drugs. Like, we know drugs like Xanax, they actually make people more anxious over time. And so there's this whole question of like, are these drugs really that effective when taken in the long term? You know, we know the 2 to 3 month trial shows that they have an effect, but like, that's the whole other question that no one's even asking. Like, how useful are these things? You know, after all of these changes and all of these months and years later. And I mean, that's the question that I don't think people are really looking into. And that's what I found when I started really thinking about this and how little we knew and how much I actually was learning more and more about the side effects. I'm just like, there is no way we should be practicing and using these drugs in the way we're currently doing it. It just seems dangerous and reckless.